So I made a video a few days ago on 5 reworked gods from Smite's history, and there was a lot of requests to do a part 2 or to cover a god that wasn't in the original video, so here we are. If you want to see part 1, I'll leave a link in the description and the card on the top right so you can watch it after this one, or pause this one and go watch it, whatever you want to do. But let's get into the list. Before I start the list, I want to give a quick mention to ALLFATHER and Sun Wukong, since their original kits were both given to new gods and they were given an entirely new set of abilities. ALLFATHER's abilities were given to Kukulkan and Wukong's were given to Hunbat's with some minor changes in a new passive. I just didn't think it was worth talking about them because their abilities are already available in game on Kukulkan and Hunbat's, so you can just check those out, they were basically the same. But let's get into the list.
Nox.
Kicking off the list, we got Nox's old kit. She's been through significant changes since her launch and she used to play really differently. She's had a couple of new passives along with a bunch of new abilities and a pretty drastic change to her ultimate. Starting off with Nox's passives, her original passive was based around damage mitigation. She still had the 4 candles that she has today and casting abilities like the candles, and she could have up to 4 candles lit at one time like her current passive, but instead of increasing her magical power, it gave her up to 16% damage mitigation, 4% per candle, and she lost the candles by taking damage like she does now. This was then changed in December of 2014 to a version that gave her free ability casts while she was at 4 candles. And it worked based on abilities cast either by allies or by enemies near Nox, but not on her own abilities. So after 4 abilities were cast near her that weren't her own, her next ability cast was 0 mana. These 2 passives in my eyes really symbolise Nox's transition from a more support focused mage, based around like damage mitigation and CC, to a more traditional damage based mage. Like, granted she still has really good utility and support aspects with the ultimate for having damage reduction and the 2-1 combo being really good lockdown, but on her initial release I feel like she was designed to be way more like supporty and utility focused. Her old first ability was Shadow Barrier. When activated, Nox gained a massive boost of damage mitigation for a short time and also granted immunity to certain forms of CC like knockups, roots and slows. It also completely negated any basic attacks fired at Nox for the duration. The damage mitigation only applied to the first damaging ability that hit her though, so after that she returned to normal and lost the mitigation. The ability went through quite a few changes before a rework, changing the amount of mitigation it granted, changing the cooldown and the duration of it, things like that. It originally went up in scaling when you level the ability from 50% to 90% mitigation as you rank it up. But similar to Nemesis' shield, how that worked at release, it was only a single second, so you had to be really choice in when you wanted to use it, so you don't get caught out without it up. By the time she was reworked, this ability was changed to a flat 80% damage mitigation at all ranks, and the duration was increased to 2 seconds. The cooldown was also much lower than at launch. At launch it was 20 seconds, and by the time she was reworked, it scaled all the way down to 14 seconds as you ranked the ability up. Also, the damage mitigation that this ability provided stacked with the 16% from Nox's passive as well, so that could grant up to 96% damage mitigation for 2 seconds, which could be pretty powerful. I'm not sure if diminishing returns applies to that or not, it probably does, but either way it's still a lot of mitigation. Her old second ability was the NIGHTFALL Raven. This ability was much simpler than her first ability, it was just a line damage that did fairly decent damage, 270 base with 70% scaling, and also silenced any one hit for 2 seconds. But there was also a built-in kind of, I guess you'd call it a passive effect on the ability, where any one hit was marked and shrouded in darkness for 5 seconds, and her third ability interacted with this debuff to do increased damage when you cast it. Speaking of a third ability, it's one you'll probably recognise, SIPHON Darkness. She still has this ability today. This ability is somewhat similar to its current form that it's in now, but it wasn't used in the same way back then. It dealt much less damage, but it was on a much lower cooldown and exploded a lot quicker. So she didn't really require another ability like she does now with Shadow Lock to combo it, she could just cast it and it would usually land. Like I mentioned earlier, this ability will consume any darkness on the target, apply by either her 2 or her ultimate, which also applies to darkness, which we'll talk about later, and it increased the damage of the ability by 50%. So it was fairly common to kind of combo her 2 into her 3, where you throw the 2 at them and it silences them for 2 seconds so they can't jump away, and then you just land the 3 on them, consume the darkness to deal the increased damage, and that could chunk people pretty hard. Like I said, the cooldown on this ability was really short. It was only 3 seconds at release, but this was eventually changed to 4 seconds, so it's kind of like a Hebo 1 kind of situation, like fairly high damage spammable ability that you can cast a lot and use it as like a poke tool, considering it only cost a flat 50 mana at all ranks. It's also worth noting this was her main clear tool back then. Alright, on to her old ultimate. This was completely different on her release as to what it is now. it was seemingly built to like counter other mages or casters that like to use their abilities a lot by punishing them for casting a lot of abilities while debuffed by the Nox ultimate. She basically linked herself to up to 3 nearby enemies and did a fairly small amount of damage on casting, and the targets were then linked to Nox for a length of time, and anytime they cast an ability they took 75% of the ultimate's damage again, and reduced Nox's cooldowns by 5 seconds. Which was pretty cool considering that you could sort of cast Siphon Darkness and then ult, and if someone cast an ability it basically just immediately reset the cooldown of Siphon Darkness so you could cast it again, which gave us some pretty solid burst damage. And then if they were still in range of you when the ultimate expired, they took another 75% of the ultimate's damage and a 1 second stun. It's kind of a hard ability to explain without seeing it in action, but it could be extremely powerful. It was capable of dealing up to 1330 base damage with 525% magical scaling if the target casts 7 abilities during the duration, like Hell or Ruler or something, casting 3 abilities, stance change, and then 3 more. Pretty unrealistic scenario, but just to kind of showcase how powerful the ability could be. Overall, her old kit seemed really fun, but in all honesty, it wasn't that viable. She was either trash or OP based on like small number tweaks and things, and her ultimate felt really shit to play against because it basically just limited your potential by stopping you casting abilities. But she certainly played really differently back then, and that's a cool thing to think about.
Odin!
Up next on the list is Odin. He's only received partial reworks, most of his abilities have stayed the same or were tweaked just a little bit, but his 2 was changed like a load, which really affected his playstyle, and he's also received numerous different passives and some tweaks to his ultimate over the years. Starting off with his passives, his very first passive was Birds of Wisdom. It was a really simple passive, it just gave him 50% increased vision range on the minimap. But this was then changed to a passive revolving around his ultimate. If any enemy dies in Odin's ultimate, he gained 5 physical power, stacking up to 10 times the 50 power total. But this was eventually moved to his ultimate and made way for a new passive that he has today. His 2 was his only majorly reworked ability. Originally this provided an AoE attack speed buff to Odin's allies for 5 seconds, up to 55% attack speed at max rank. But this was eventually reworked into Raven Shield and made way for the Bird Bomb style of play that Odin is now known for. His ultimate has also received some changes over time. Originally, no one could escape the ability by walking through it. Not Odin, not enemies, not allies, nobody could walk through it. But this was obviously changed. Firstly, Odin himself was given the ability to walk through it, but not teammates. But eventually it was just changed to all of Odin's allies, including himself, could move freely in and out of the cage. Back in the day, Odin gained like increased protections, power and movement speed, along with full CC immunity while inside the ring. And he could also bring the ring down at any time by reactivating the ultimate. This saw numerous changes over time, removing all the self buffs that Odin gave himself and adding attack speed and healing reduction to enemies in the ring, as well as allowing allies to pass through it freely, like I said before. Odin's wasn't really a full rework as such, but he was changed pretty significantly and he plays really differently now than before, so I thought he deserved a mention on the list.
Ratatoskr.
Closing out the list, we got Ratatoskr. This is another partial kit rework, as some of his abilities stayed the same or only had minor changes, but others were changed pretty drastically. We'll start with his dash. On Rat's original release, his dash was quite a bit different to how it is now. It could go through enemy gods rather than stopping on the first god hit, and if you hit an enemy god, it would reset the cooldown of dart and allow you to cast it again. This could only occur once per god though. Still, this allows you to potentially have 6 dashes before the ability goes on cooldown if you hit all 5 enemy gods with the dash. This was eventually changed to only allow 2 resets per cast of the ability, but on this release this was crazy OP. We'll get onto his passive later that could augment this ability and make it even more OP, but we'll go through the rest of his abilities first so we can better understand his passive. So next up is Flurry of ACORNs. This ability sent out 12 ACORNs around you that do damage on the way out and then return to your character after a brief time. And you could combo this ability pretty well with dart, like you'd send the ACORNs out and then dash through someone as the ACORNs were coming back, and it would ensure that almost all of the ACORNs, if not all of them, would hit on the way back for some pretty serious burst damage. His 3 was basically the same as it is now, except it was 4 ACORNs instead of 3, and it didn't stun if you hit all the ACORNs like it does now. It did pretty decent damage if you could land all 4 ACORNs, and could also be augmented by some of the ACORNs from his passive, which we'll talk about in a bit. And his ultimate was barely changed, they just reduced the damage on it a little bit and added a knock up to it. There's not much else to say about it. So let's get onto his passive. I've left this to last because you kind of need to know how his old abilities work to fully understand this passive and what it provides, because this was a big part of the reason he was so OP on his release. Basically, instead of getting 1 ACORN instead of your boots like you do now, he had 4 options to choose from with different effects for each ACORN. There was a choice between Topaz, Opal, Emerald and Sapphire ACORNs. Every ACORN provided 50 physical power and 25% cooldown reduction along with the unique effect of it. Also, it's worth noting that with old Ratatoska, the ACORN didn't replace his boots like the new one does, so you could buy boots plus an ACORN. OPAL was by far the most powerful and most picked up ACORN of the four. Its unique effect was that it applied lightning bolts to the side of Rat's dashes that did additional damage and could proc item effects like Golden Bow, Frostbound Hammer, and it could also crit. Being able to crit and slow people with dash and proc Golden Bow AoE damage was complete cancer, trust me. If you weren't around when Rat was released and you didn't experience this, I envy you, it was cancer. The next most popular ACORN was definitely Emerald. If Rat was ever played in solo lane, this was almost always the ACORN he took because it augmented the ACORN blast to heal him for each ACORN hit up to 4. This could heal for up to 240 plus 80% of physical power per cast of the ability, which is pretty significant considering it was only on a 10-second cooldown, which went down to 7.5 seconds with the ACORN's cooldown reduction, which gave him some pretty mad sustainability for solo lane. Those were the two that were really used. The other two were marginally used and had some success, but nowhere near as much as Emerald or Opal. There was the SAPPHIRE ACORN, which was basically just a damage augment to his ACORN blast, making it do more. It turned the ACORNs into sticky bombs that exploded after 2 seconds of hitting for additional damage. So it still did the impact damage of the 3, but then they also exploded later for additional damage. Like, granted, the damage on 3 was pretty insane with this. It did 400 base with 260% scaling if all 4 ACORNs hit and exploded on the same target. But it just wasn't worth dropping the effects of Opal and Emerald to pick this up, really. And the last ACORN to talk about is TOPAZ. This was by far the least popular ACORN. It basically just added a stun to his dash if you hit the same person 2 times within 10 seconds. Like, the stun was decent at 2 seconds at max rank, but it wasn't really worth using your dash up just to get a stun when you could just buy Opal or Emerald and be much better off. But that still didn't stop me from doing Rat support with it back in the day, because, you know, I'm a pro. So that's 3 more reworked gods from Smite's history. I think I've covered basically every rework in the game now between the 2 videos, so make sure you check out the first one if you haven't already. But that's about it. Peace out, nerds.